I want to talk about one of my favorite records, and it is Arthur Russell's World of Echo from 1986. And for those who are unfamiliar with Arthur Russell, he was this New York City based cellist, composer, electronic DJ, and musician, avant garde artist. And he was making a lot of waves in the 70s and 80s in New York, although he never really was at the forefront of things because he was popular in terms of his DJing and his disco music, which he would release through pseudonyms such as Dinosaur, and there was Indian Ocean, there was Loose Joints. In the 70s, he would go on to play with many of the downtown New Yorkers who would end up revolutionizing the new wave scene. For example, I know he is on one of the versions of Talking Heads. Psycho Killer, he plays the cello in one of their early recordings of it, not the one that actually goes on their debut album, but it is an incredible. Arthur Russell's an incredible person, and many people at the time regarded him as some kind of a genius of sorts. Although history hasn't done so well for him, I think, in terms of how his music has been talked about in the present day, which I feel like is it's very unfortunate because he is such a great musician. When I first heard World of Echo a couple of years ago, I remember finding it very confusing. I didn't understand what I was listening to. I had the same level of confusion that I had perhaps when I was listening to Trout Mask Replica or something. And I remember I heard it maybe one or two times and I just left it out to the side for a while. It got recommended to me somewhere online, and I just didn't get it, so I left it alone. And then in 2016, I was listening to Kanye West's Life of Pablo, and I was surprised that on the song 30 Hours, towards the end of the track list, there was a sample of Arthur Russell, specifically his song Answers Me from World of Echo. And I remember thinking it was very odd that, Kanye West listens to Arthur Russell. So I had to go back and check him out again, and this time I listened to the album in a more closed environment. I had good headphones on, and I didn't have any distractions around me, and I just immersed myself in the music. And what I found out about the music was that it's so beautifully raw and unpolished. It's weird because it seems like the album is so purposefully imperfect in a way that it kind of goes against what you would learn about Arthur Russell if you actually read about him, because he was known as this kind of very strong perfectionist. He was such a perfectionist that he only released one proper non-collaborative solo album in his career, which was World of Echo, because he would always be in the process of mixing his music and adding and subtracting from the things that he was composing. And because of this, he only has that one album that came out after he died in 1991, I think, or 1990, after he passed away or 92 actually, when he died of AIDS, I think. A lot of his music ended up becoming lost to his archives until people like Philip Glass, for example, went into his music and really released some of the ones that some of the music he was working on that didn't see the light of day. And that's where you get stuff like Another Thought or Calling Out of Context, or he has many of them, Corn, for example. And when I got back into Arthur Russell in 2016, and after I listened to World of Echo over and over again, and I fell in love with the mythology of it. I started to explore more of his music, and I started listening to his disco music, so specifically under Loose Joints. I remember the song specifically. I remember was I think, Is It All Over My Face, the female version of it. It was like a 10, and the male version of it, I think, it was like an 10-minute song. And I found these albums online of the collections of his music. I think there's one called The World of Arthur Russell that really introduced me to a lot of his disco music. And after a while, I started to read more about him. I got there's a book, like an autobiography, no, it's a biography about him, called, I have it over here, it's called Hold On to Your Dreams, and it's such a great read. It really it brings you from when he started off in Iowa until when he moved to New York City and met Allen Ginsberg and really got involved with the downtown scene. You realize how much he had a hand on so many of the scenes in New York at the time, and how influential he really was. And it's kind of unfortunate that he isn't as talked about much today, because what struck me from getting into his discography was realizing how much of a how diverse his musical styles were. He never really wanted to pigeonhole himself into one genre or one kind of music. He has one of his albums called Instrumentals, which was released later on. Again, it is classical compositions. This is classical music, mostly, and then on Another Thought in 1994, most of them are kind of, it's hard to really classify, but there are these experimental rock, I like to say. I mean, it's hard to really classify, but he plays cello on a lot of it, and there is Calling Out of Context. There's even a country album. It's called, let me look for it. Love Is Overtaking Me, where it's straight up folk country. It's fascinating because he was someone who's always trying to integrate genres with each other and try to, trying to really just push forward what you would expect to hear from music and not be pigeonholed into one kind of sound. It's unfortunate that he died so young, because he was such a genius. World of Echo, when you hear it, it sounds very abrasive. It's very abrasive and very hard to listen to casually, perhaps, but there is a beauty in the rawness of it all, and the rawness of emotion, and the abstractness of the lyrics. If you just give yourself up to it, I think you get this amazing spiritual experience. It's like when I hear it, whenever I listen to it, it's like a very much a spiritual experience for me, and it's one of the few musical experiences I have had that whenever I listen to it, I'm just into this very meditative zone that puts me on another planet, and this mind of Arthur Russell, trying to understand what he was on about and what went through his head. It's a great album. Treehouse, all these songs, Soon to Be Innocent, Let's See, Tower of Meaning, all these songs are all incredible. And when you get into Arthur Russell, I don't think that this is the best album to first listen to with Arthur Russell. It's probably best to listen to his disco music first. Maybe listen to the world of Arthur Russell and get a nice overview of his disco avant-garde stuff. He has Go Bang's a popular one. Let's Go Swimming has a couple of DJ remixes. Schoolbell Treehouse as well. But yeah, he's such an incredible and an indelible figure in the New York downtown scene in the 70s and 80s. Especially when I read the book, you really learn how much he was an influence on everyone around him. And upon learning more about him, I realized that many of my favorite artists, for example, are very much fans of Arthur Russell and very much inspired by him and influenced by him. For example, I'm wearing this LCD Sound System shirt. James Murphy says Arthur Russell is a big influence on him as well. And just in general, I'm such a big fan of this album. And if you want to give yourself an experience of listening to something that is there's nothing that sounds like this. I don't know any other actually. He's a cellist, so most of his songs are voiced in cello. I don't know any other artist that sounds like him. Any artist that is as diverse in their musical output as him, and just as fearless as him in terms of just the directions he would put himself in and go towards. And I'm very lucky to have been able to discover his music and really just immerse myself in all of it. So I would highly recommend, if anyone's very interested in, especially read this book. Hold On to Your Dreams. It's a great one, and it's about his life. But yeah, Arthur Russell, World of Echo, 1986. Great record, avant-garde, experimental electronic music, and very abstract, very moving, very beautiful in its own way, very raw and polished, but just wholly unique, and you should check it out.